Now, I happen to be on a different side of this from people that I really care about. So I don't think not everyone has bad intent when they talk about this issue, but we fundamentally disagree on what the valuable principles are. So let's start from whether this was legally correct decision. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has a long history of disregarding what the Constitution actually says. Now, unlike the political branches, the Supreme Court is restricted. It's, in fact, the judicial branch itself is restricted to following what the law says, or in this case, what the Constitution says. Unlike other branches, they cannot freestyle it and put in their own thoughts and biases to it. That's not their job. Their job is to adjudicate a case, right? The law is an agreement either between the people and their government or an agreement between two people, depending on whether it's a contract. In this case, the Supreme Court, about 40 to 50 years ago, just outrightly disregarded what the Constitution actually said. So, and it happened in a really natural way. So, before Brown versus Board of Education, there was Plessy, which stated that you could have separate but equal accommodations for different races. So, a state could create train carriages, for instance, where one part was white only and one part was black only, but as long as both carriages looked basically the same, had the same amenities, that this was basically equality. So the 14th Amendment wasn't violated. Now, before that, note that the 13th Amendment freed all the slaves, and then the Civil Rights Act after that, 1866, I think, gave everybody equal rights. The problem was that if you were a former slave and you weren't, when the Constitution was originally written, you weren't really a person, so you didn't have the rights of a person. The issue they faced was that many states that had slaves before took that as a loophole to argue that the slaves were no longer, the released slaves were no longer people, were not people, and therefore they did not have the same rights under the law. And Congress tried to deal with this in many different ways, but states found a way around it, and there were good counter arguments on either side when it came to the law. A few years later, Congress realized that, look, they just had to deal with this thoroughly, right? So here came the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment, they stated that we're making everybody equal. As long as you were born in this country at the time, because many slaves had been there for many years now. So they had children there. And so the statement was, as long as you are born in the country and subject to the laws of the country and not subject to the laws of any other foreign country, right, you were automatically a citizen. So that took care of the whole rights issue, the whole conversation as to whether blacks, recently released slaves, were people under the law. And then the second clause of that amendment stated that everyone was to be treated equally. No, you could not make laws that were unequally enforced or make laws against a specific people or a specific race, right? And the purpose of that law was to make sure that where in the past they had loopholes where they could make certain laws against black people or for black people and make laws for white people, they could enforce the laws differently. The 14th Amendment was to take care of all of those loopholes. It was, you had to treat everybody the same under the law. Simple. Now, that didn't come to, now that goes back to Plessy, where in Plessy they said you could have separate but equal, right? And then at some point, due to all the problems that the judiciary was having enforcing this on different levels of the government around the country, the judiciary decided that, look, let's get rid of all of that. All of that is crap. The 14th Amendment doesn't say anything about having separate. It says you must treat everyone equally. And by definition, if you have to separate services, they're not equal, right? Because by definition, you're treating somebody separately or differently, not because of anything of merit, but because of the color of their skin. And the fact that you're treating them differently, the fact that you treat one race differently from another itself means that the services are not equal. So they got rid of that whole jurisprudence. Now, what ended up happening was Brown versus Board of Education came where the Supreme Court told the state of, I think it was Texas, I don't remember now, but it told that state, you have only two options. You either desegregate your schools or you shut the schools down. Those are the only two options you have. And President Eisenhower, who didn't support the ruling, enforced it either way. He sent in the military there to escort some of the children to school to make sure they were integrated. The idea was, if anything, it's separate is not going to be equal by definition. And the country was not going to tolerate the treatment of one people based on the color of their skin differently from another. Shortly thereafter, however, when the schools then started integrating, they faced the problem of, now, there was a big delta, right? Because once you start integrating schools, and the question then becomes, when you have admissions processes where you have to evaluate the students, the black students were way behind. They were way behind because the quality of their schools were lower. Quality of their teachers were lower. The only way then that they could integrate the schools as quickly as they wanted to was, in their opinion, to select some students based on their race to bring them into school. Now, that became a problem because fundamentally the Constitution does not allow this, and the Supreme Court knew this. So the Supreme Court, in a case called Grutter, gave what ended up becoming a very vague standard, and did something that is unconstitutional. You see, when it comes to issues of policy, that's left to Congress. But the Supreme Court cannot, for instance, say we suspend the Constitution for 25 years, and after 25 years, this action that we've allowed will become illegal. That's not their job. That's the job of Congress. And Congress cannot suspend the Constitution without going through a constitutional process. So the Supreme Court did it anyway. They told the school, I forgot what school it was, but they issued a ruling stating that for the next, they expect that in 25 years, this will not be needed anymore, but they will allow it for 25 years. And that's the pendulum swinging the other way. That was illegal and it was unconstitutional. You cannot make decisions based on race. Now, this is actually the legitimate part of other people's counter argument. The fact that if you really think about it, the system had screwed up black Americans for a long time. So when they came into a higher institution where you had to go through an admissions process, they would by definition be behind because there was a huge delta. They didn't have the same opportunities as before. So how do you fix that? Now, the schools took the shortcut. The shortcut is, we will just take a bunch of black people and put them into the schools so that we make up for the past mistakes that we made, or we meet up to the new desegregation requirements. But if you fundamentally think about it, that does no favors to anybody. It doesn't do any favors to the black students who were picked and put into the schools, because, now I'm talking of higher education and where you have to go through an admissions process, because they didn't qualify. So to actually fix the mistakes of the past, the work they needed to do was harder. They needed to do the hard work of going back to the elementary schools and upgrading those. They needed to go to offer adult education, which many African countries, when we later got Western style education, was what happened. Adults that were already grown up that couldn't go through elementary and secondary school took adult education and learned to read and learned to write. So you could do that. You could create adult level education. You could upgrade the elementary and secondary schools, but that takes hard work and it takes years. And it takes refining because you discover some things will not work. So you change and you keep refining it. That is harder work. The shortcut was just admit a quota of black students into the schools, regardless of whether they qualify to be there, right? There is nothing that even says that an institution of higher education cannot create special programs where you do 1 or 2 years, kind of what community colleges do, right? But nothing said that an institution of higher learning couldn't create 1 or 2 years where these students who didn't have the same quality of education will come in through a rigorous program, go through a rigorous first 1 or 2 years, then add another 2 or 3 years at the end of that. So they graduate with a degree. This method that was used was a shortcut. Now, it was an unconstitutional shortcut, but the Supreme Court was on a roll. It was on a roll of we are getting these schools desegregated. And rather than considering the fact that they themselves are violating the Constitution, which states you cannot, you cannot unequally apply the laws. You have to equally apply laws regardless of a person's skin color. That was the whole battle in the first place. Now, people argue that because it's not negative racism. It's not, I'm looking at a white person and I'm saying, because you're white, I'm not going to give you admission. I'm not looking at a black person and saying, because you're black, I won't give you admission. What I'm saying is, I'm looking at a black person and for good reason, right? There's been segregation against you in the past. So for good reason, I'm going to give you a pass. I'm going to give you admission. It's positive, if I'll call it, positive racism. Then, and if you're against that, think about it this way too. I could see a logic of someone saying, okay, in desperately poor white neighborhoods, we'll create a special school for poor white kids, or we'll create special admissions programs for poor white kids who have had it worse than others, right? It's not right, but I understand the logic. It's not coming from a place of animosity. You're not fighting someone. You're trying to do good. It's still racist because by definition, and I don't say that to condemn it in of itself because the intent is good, and as humans we judge intent. The intent is good, but by definition, if two people walk into a room and for one person his race is an advantage, by definition it means the race for another is not an advantage. Now trying to change that happening in the past, trying to change it such that in the past a white person walked into a room and his race by definition was an advantage. In an effort to change that, you then switch it up to say a black person, a white and a black person walk into a room, and for the black person, his race becomes an advantage. Your conscience may accept it because, hey, there was racism against them in the past. And the other guy, his race, not him specifically, or maybe him in some areas, but specifically in this instance, his race may have benefited in the past. So I don't feel so bad. It's still wrong. The principle is still violated. Two people have walked in a room and you're not judging them based on the merit of what they can actually do. You're judging them based on the color of their skin. It is wrong. It is wrong. It is so clearly wrong. It is wrong that we've accepted, but it is wrong that is still wrong. It's something that all the Supreme Court cases I've read, all of them, the firefighters' cases, the college cases, in every single case where I heard or I read the argument of the justices, they couldn't get around the point that this is just fundamentally wrong. It is wrong. It is wrong. It is wrong to see two people and you judge them not based on what they can do, not based on their capabilities, not based on their merits. You don't give a crap what the person himself is. By definition, who he is matters very little to you. He walks into a room and you have made a judgment on him only based on who he is. It is wrong. It is fundamentally wrong. It violates every single tenet of decency that any civilized people can follow. And affirmative action was always wrong on all levels. It is so wrong. I understand why it's there. I understand why it's not as offensive as white supremacy, for instance. It's still fundamentally wrong. So what do you do? What do you do as a black kid? How do you give black people the same shot? At the end of the day, we want a society where no matter where you come from, whether you're wealthy or you're rich, whether you're wealthy or you're poor, when you walk into a place, you're judged based on what you can do, what you're capable of doing. And if you want to build that kind of society, then what do you do for the black kids who do not have that opportunity? You do the work. Look at black schools, for God's sake. Look at black neighborhoods, for heaven's sake. They are in the worst conditions ever. That's why black kids do not in the same proportion get into those schools that you want them to get into. So you have to do the work. You have to do the work. You have to do the work of upgrading those schools. You have to do work of tearing down schools that don't work. Like Americans are comfortable with a particular way of doing things, and that's all humans. But if you want to do better, you have to change what you're doing. You have to do something different. So look into those schools, attack those issues as if they're pressing, and take care of the schools, take care of the elementary schools, encourage more black kids to keep going higher and higher and higher, and make it look profitable for them. People will go where there is profit in terms of financial profit, professional profit, but also societal profit, where they'll get some respect from the society because of what they're doing. And if that's not where they are, move them from there. You have to do something radical, but do it so that you will get to the point where there will be the same proportion, or at the very least, racism will not be the reason why there isn't the same proportion, right? For instance, Asians, they're a minority part of the population, but yet they make up most of the great colleges out there. So it's possible. It can be done. We just need to figure out how to do it. But you cannot do it based on, hey, we're just going to take a shortcut. There are two people here, and I'm going to say this guy is black, maybe went through some things in the past. Now, again, you can consider those things they've been through in the past and look at the tenacity, because tenacity will tell you that, okay, they've been through this in the past, they may have slightly less scores, but if they had had the same opportunity, because of the tenacity that they have, they'll do better. So if you put them into the school, now you've given them an equal footing, they will work so hard that they'll meet up to the other person who had higher grades than them or even surpass them. Why? Because they have tenacity. So if you give that person a shot, if you give them the opportunity, they'll do well. But affirmative action has always been a fundamentally wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. And like I understand it. It's also scary. It's scary to think that you're going to have to be required to meet up to what other people are. But it's just. It's just. And justice always takes away from one to give to another, by definition, right? But the reason why it's justified is that it balances a skill. Now, in this case, the skill is you walk into a room, nobody gives a crap about who you are. Now, in reality, that will take a lot of work, because a lot of systems will have to be set up to make sure that school officials, for instance, are not judging candidates based on their race alone. And so you may have to set up blind admissions processes, for instance, where a person's name, for instance, does not play a big part. You may have to allow some transparency into schools, so that, especially schools that take federal funding, so that the government can make sure that schools are not fundamentally discriminating against black and brown kids. But all that work is worth it for a society where everybody is equal, where everybody is judged based on their capacity, capability, where a poor black kid can start up from nothing and he knows he has a shot of getting to the top. And when he gets to the top, yes, he will bless society, right? Because a lot of people paved a lot of way for him to get there. There's a lot of hard work that had been put. Society had to put up all these other structures to make sure that he has a fair shot, that everybody has a fair shot. But once he gets there, he has the extra pride of knowing that he got there because he could. And when things go wrong, he knows that he can face those things that have gone wrong and fix them. Why? Because he can. He has the innate capability. He doesn't need the government to always help him. Where he needs help, he'll reach out to someone. But when he wins, he knows he won because he's capable of winning, not because the skills were tilted in his favor. That itself is a mental win for him that other systems cannot give. I'll see you guys in the next one.